Okay, so Sevagoth Prime has finally arrived, and I'll be honest boys, I think it's time we give this Warframe his flowers. Sevagoth has just been considered a gloom vessel for the past few years of his life. If you're unsure what I mean, basically Sevagoth has just been subsumed a lot, and people are mainly farming him so they can use gloom on other Warframes. I'd make the argument that ever since he got some tweaks and of course the additions of some of his new augments, this frame has a hell of a lot more to offer than just being used as a helmet ability. He's not the most underrated frame in the game, but in terms of his own functionality being overlooked, he's probably at the top of the pack. He has so much to offer. Not only does he of course have gloom himself, but his actual kit synergizes very nicely with it, and I think people tend to overlook how good his shadow is, as well as the scaling damage on his first ability. I will say one huge downside that we can get into is the fact that this frame takes a shit ton of former, but of course I'm going to show off a couple of really nice builds you can use today. The first one being way more focused on using his entire base kit that includes his shadow, as well as the crit bonuses that one of his augments has to offer. So we'll be covering not only health tank versions of him that can be used for general use, but we're also going to cover a shield gate version of Sev that you guys can use at higher level content. And the second build will be more focused on his scaling damage that the combination of his Reap and Sow has to offer with its augments. He may not be the best frame in the game, but in my opinion he is extremely reliable, has one of the best exalted weapons in the game, a multitude of ways in which you could build him, and one of the most fun playstyles the game has to offer. Because the Prime has just released, we're going to quickly cover his abilities for anyone that maybe just wants to get into the character and isn't familiar, starting with his passive. When Sevagoth dies, he will enter his own sarcophagus very similar to that of Inaros. And when this happens, you'll enter your shadow form and gain a charge forward attack that does infinite scaling one-shot damage to any enemy it hits, and you have to hit 5 enemies with this attack in order to revive yourself. This is a really good passive overall, but eventually it's going to fall off and you will just get one-shotted because unfortunately the mods that affect maybe your shield gate on your actual shadow form wouldn't affect the shield gate on this version within the passive. So unfortunately all the dashing forward attacks can't be utilised with the shield gate, meaning that eventually you will just get one shot. And of course he also has the death well meter, which is a part of his fourth ability, and we'll get onto that later. His first ability, Reap, isn't really worth talking about on its own. It sends out a shadow and it will chain between enemies and do damage to them, but really this ability is only worth talking about when we combine it with his second ability, Sow. Sow acts as a sort of debuff. When you cast this on enemies that are hit by your first ability, Reap, will detonate in an explosion that does health % base damage, and this scales infinitely. His third ability, Gloom, is a radial AoE that drains your energy over time, and enemies within the AoE will be slowed for up to 50% of their movement speed, and you'll also gain health upon killing enemies. And your fourth ability is Shadow, which can only be activated once you've filled up the Death Well. In order to fill up the Death Well, you need to get kills when combining the 2 with the 1. When you enter Shadow, you will gain 3 new abilities, as well as Sevagoth's Exalted Claws. Your first ability when in Shadow is Embrace, which is an AoE grouping tool which pulls enemies towards you. Your second ability, Consume, is basically the charge from your passive, where you charge forward at a single target and in return you'll gain health if you hit them. And your third ability, Death Harvest, is a massive AoE debuff. And of course your fourth ability is simply Reunite, which is to enter back to your Warframe. Now, some important things to note before we jump into the actual builds. We need to cover the 2 augments in which we are using today. These augments are for both Reap, that being Shadow Haze, and Sow, which is Dark Propagation. Upon reading, Shadow Haze is a bit confusing at first. You are granted critical chance for enemies that are inflicted with Death Harvest, and Death Harvest is the third ability from the Shadow form, but that is also inflicted by your first ability, Reap, when you are sending out the shadows. And once you kill those enemies that are marked by Death Harvest, they spawn in a new shadow to basically be rechained, up to a total of 3 at one time. The Dark Propagation augment, however, is for Sow, and it spreads the effect to enemies when you kill them once they are under the effect. And in addition to this, Death Harvest from your first and your third ability when you're in Shadow also inflicts Sow and makes your first ability have insane scaling explosions. So what we've got here is basically a way to produce infinite shadows via the augment on your 1 combined with the infinite spreading of Sow from Dark Propagation. So these 2 augments work perfectly together, and once you cast your 2 on a horde of enemies and then send out your 1, killing massive hordes at a time, especially if you proc them with something like Viral, the shadows that you're going to send out are going to constantly be going through hordes of enemies and respawning, spreading Sow, debuffing, exploding, rinse and repeat. And whilst most people may be familiar with this playstyle, especially when you combine it with something like Raw, when you replace the Exalted Shadow, which is of course a build we'll cover later, something that is incredibly slept on with this combo is the fact that using Death Harvest in Exalted Shadow on a group of enemies and then swiping at them with your claws is one of the most broken combos that Sevagoth has access to. As you can see by the gameplay, not only am I killing hordes of enemies, but they're sending out those shadows for massive scaling explosive damage, basically rendering any enemy I come across to be borderline one-shot or dead by the time I get to them. And I have the grouping from my first ability as well. I feel like this combo isn't talked about at all, and in my opinion this makes Sevagoth's overall kit synergize together much better than it would normally, because instead of just being in Exalted Shadow and using the Shadow's abilities, you're also summoning the Shadow of Reap and Sow from your Warframe version of the kit whilst you're in Shadow. So now you have a seamless transition between both forms of Sevagoth. So as for the playstyle with the base kit, you are reaping what has been sown with your 2 and your 1, keeping your 3 active at all times, and then whenever you want and you have your well filled up, you can enter your 4th, cast your 1 and your 3, and I guess your 2 whenever you need to heal, and then having your Shadow spawn from the form you were just in, and go through all the corridors ahead of you, just tearing down everything in their path. In my honest opinion, this is a really solid way to play him. I know to some people it may seem kind of redundant in the fact that the second build we go over, where we replace the 4 with Raw, allows you to just spam your Reap and your Sow over and over, and not worry about entering Exalted Shadow at all. And whilst that playstyle is very fun and effective, if you ever want to switch it up and use the Exalted Shadow in a way that actually feels good, I highly recommend you try out the first build, which we'll cover right now. So for the first mod setup, we're going with a combination of sustainability, strength, range and survivability. Of course our 2 augments are in here, then we have fleeting expertise and equilibrium for sustain on our energy, umbral intensify and molt augmented for our strength, adaptation, arcane blessing and brief respite for survivability. Brief respite does keep us alive quite a lot just from shield gating, even though we aren't using something like catalyzing shields. Brief Respite is interchangeable because we have an Aura Former in here, and Arcane Blessing isn't a must-have. This is super interchangeable, maybe something like Avenger is better in here, or even Aegis. And then we've got Prime Continuity to offset some of that lost duration from fleeting, and Prime Shot Footed so we don't get knocked down. As for the Shadow setup that I was using in the gameplay in the background, I went with a more health-oriented setup. This won't take you too far because eventually you're going to start taking massive amounts of damage, but I'll show off a more shield gate oriented build in a second just for the Shadow. Archon Vitality is in here because we're also using a bit of heat damage on our claws. Archon Intensify works here because we are healing ourselves a lot with our 2. And Amar's Anguish is really nice here because I personally find the movement speed really slow on the Shadow and it's very annoying. And I would definitely recommend Arcane Fury because it makes the claws 10 times better. And if you want a higher scaling build that focuses on shield gating, in this build we're combining Brief Respite with a bunch of shield regen and Aegis, and Umbral Intensify can be swapped out for Rolling Guard. And this is the melee setup I was using. Of course we're running Viral and Heat to make use of Archon Vitality, but if you're not using the Archon Vitality build and you're going with the shield gate setup, you can drop Volcanic Edge for something different. And of course, we do want a primer for our shadows, and how convenient that Sevagoth Prime released with the Epitaph Prime, so of course we've got some really low effort Viral setup. This requires no former, and I'm just using it as a primer, so I could throw a bit more damage in here and throw this in the Exilus. This is going to easily spread Viral and make sure that we're one-shotting enemies with our shadows. And for when we're not in our Exalted Shadow and using the grouping of the first, we can get grouping via the newly released Nautilus Prime. Just make sure you've got Cordon on, and then of course Synth Deconstruct is going to drop more health orbs whenever the Sentinel attacks enemies, and it's going to help with equilibrium. And of course we're also using a Madurai, mainly for the casting speed because I feel like it makes Sevagoth feel way better, but you can also gain bonus strength from Sling Strength. And in the gameplay in the background I was using the Bursting Prime Incarnon, so here are the Incarnon forms. And now we're moving on to the build which most of you guys will probably be familiar with by now. We're simply replacing the Shadow with Raw, and what this allows us to do is to pump out way more damage when we're combining our Reap with our Sow. So the playstyle revolves around keeping your 3 active and just spamming your 1 and your 2, and of course keeping Raw active at the same time. This will absolutely nuke corridors, and of course you don't really need the primer as much. It's a playstyle choice. Me personally, I like having the Shadow because I think it's quite fun, and just using an Epitaph with Viral means that I don't need Raw, but if you're not really feeling like using a primer, the Raw setup is extremely efficient and a much more easy to understand playstyle. As for this build, we're focusing way more on the shield gate aspect, as we are completely dropping Blessing for Arcane Energize, then throwing Catalyzing Shields with Rolling Guard and Breathe Respite. And the Energize isn't mandatory, but it is going to be useful because obviously we're going to be spamming our abilities way more with this setup, not only to make use of that damage buff from Raw, but also so we can shield gate more effectively. And our strength and efficiency and duration is roughly the same as the previous build. So if you're not a fan of the Exalted Shadow, this is the setup I recommend giving a go. And of course, let's not completely forget that the huge crit buff you get from the augment for his Reap makes Sevagoth not only a great caster Warframe with the amount of scaling damage he has, but he's also a really good weapons platform. Being able to pump out easy red crits with a bunch of your weapons just gives another element to his playstyle, and I make the argument that Sevagoth was good even before his augments. The augments just add something new to his playstyle, such as, the ability to spread the scaling damage with less ability casts, and of course give him a bit more synergy between both his forms. But don't be mistaken, this isn't an augment based Warframe, he's still very strong without them, and I'd say the biggest disadvantage of Sev is of course his investment. He requires a lot of Former, but luckily the Prime version doesn't require as many. I'm going to leave you guys with the rest of the gameplay that I have, as well as the fashion from the video. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe. My Twitch will also be linked in the description, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care. Damage numbers? Yeah, basically it's the it's the dual augment setup. But what a lot of people don't realize is that those two augments also work together in Shadow, and you can spread them via the Shadow's third ability. Like you use your 3 on them and then you kill them, and it spreads the Shadows. And they also do scaling damage, but the reason why it's extra powerful on the Shadow is because the 3 is a debuff. So, it's good normally, in the Warframe, with them spreading everywhere. But it's also really potent in the Shadow as well. That's why I fuck with this setup, because it can actually use the Shadow to great effect. I use my tree right here, and then I kill one of these guys. All these red numbers pop up, and that's the Shadow spreading. Here we go. And they do scaling damage, so everything I hit is basically already one shot.
Lotus supports your choices.